Afternoon. It is June the 8th, 2023. I'm Matthew Holt, the publisher and founder of the healthcare blog. It's THCB gang time, and I have, at last, apart from me and Kim Bellard, who's one of our guests today, finally drummed out some of the white chromosomes who've been hanging around lately. On this edition with Kim Bellard and myself is Deven McGraw, head of data stewardship at Invitae and Citizen, Jen Benz from Siegel Benz, and Rosemarie from Day Health Strategies. So delighted to have all of you on. Thrilled to have you back. And first off, we need Jen to tell us about Tahiti, where she's been spending her honeymoon delayed from 2020 for the last 3 years. Would you recommend it, Jen? Should we all be going, and should we do the next edition there?
Yes, we should all go. We should come up with any boondoggle reason to make it a business trip. And yes, highly recommend. Tahiti and French Polynesia was amazing. Really, really beautiful part of the world.
Oh, wonderful.
And really beautiful culture and beautiful language there too.
Why did you come back?
That's a great question.
We'll ponder that on the rest of it. Okay. Well, but congrats on the remarrying, and the joke is that Andre, your husband, I am the only person that you both knew in comedy, even though I had nothing to do with it. I don't even know how you met and got together, but I knew him back in the 2000s when he was just a wild guy having parties, and now he's a sensible man. I guess.
Very true.
All right, fantastic. Well, we should probably start talking about healthcare, given that we can't all go to Tahiti, and I don't see, unless a sponsor wants to, gin up and provide money to relocate the show to Tahiti, I'd be very happy to do that, but I don't see one of those on the horizon. So let's chat about what's going on in the world and the world of healthcare. Rosemarie, haven't had you on for a while, so why don't you start?
Well, I think we were chatting ahead of time. Maybe several of you were going to bring up the wildfires that are, I think, a huge wake-up call for those of us who are perched here on the East Coast, that often can, not me, because I do come from California, but there many people can have that like, oh, well, out there where they have, wildfires raging out of control. That has nothing to do with us over here where we have, still plenty of rain and all the things. And now suddenly folks in New York City are wearing gas, in the 95s, I think you are, Deven, and that kind of sense of connectivity that I think the pandemic brought to us, even though many people tried to ignore it, but that we are kind of all in this together. And there are some pretty cataclysmic type of events that are affecting our health. And we need to be, paying better attention to our entire ecosystem and prioritizing that. And as much as I'm championing health reform and all those things, this seems like the meta issue, and it's again getting a lot of people's attention. So I'm putting that top of the list today. I have some other things, if we get to it, I'd love to talk about around mental health and such, and maybe some bright spots there. But I'll start with the thing that cannot be ignored.
Yeah, we've had some pieces lately about I think Mike McGee wrote a piece about AI and global warming and how they were sort of connected, but it's very much back to your end of the rowboat is sinking, but luckily my end's okay. Oh, hang on, it doesn't work that way. So I'm totally with you, and these things are connected, because if you think about it, climate change has a massive impact on immigration and migration, and it's a massive impact on the healthcare system and obviously on health as well. So there's so many things that are so connected. Kim.
Well, I was going to talk about the wildfires because even here in Cincinnati, which is, I don't know, 1,000 miles plus away from the wildfires, we're impacted as well. I think we're not at the nearly the levels of DC, but we're impacted as well. But so it's kind of scary. So instead, I'll talk about Merck finally got around to suing the government for taking away its property with negotiating prices. I'm actually surprised it took this long for one of the drug companies to do that, and I'm very curious to see how the courts view this. So they say that they have to be in Medicare. They can't afford not to be. So any effort to negotiate is unconstitutional. So it's an expected argument, and I hope does not find a receptive audience.
We shall see. Deven, what have you been looking at?
That's an interesting one, Kim. We could probably dedicate an entire session and bring a couple of Supreme Court experts in to sort of noodle over that one. I'm focusing a little bit, I'm down a couple of deep rabbit holes around some comment deadlines that are coming up for regulatory proposals, one being the latest proposal from the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT regarding, sort of what's the next generation of certification standards for health IT and other authorities under that ONC has to promote interoperability, some clarifications around the information blocking rules, lots of comment deadline coming up. So lots of discussion around some of those proposals there, including what do we do when patients want to restrict certain portions of their record and when they share it, not send all of it, which is related to, of course, the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs. And there was another pending rulemaking from the Office for Civil Rights at HHS regarding proposed changes to the HIPAA privacy rule to provide some greater protection for data that is generated out of the delivery of a lawful healthcare service and whether it ever should be disclosable to an entity for use in some sort of proceeding, whether it's administrative or criminal, against either the patient or the patient's doctor for the delivery of that lawful service, potentially out of state boundaries in some cases, or if you're thinking of emergency medical treatment that is required to be delivered under the Federal Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, was lawfully delivered in that context. So that rulemaking, the comments are due in a couple of weeks, assuming that the comment deadline is not extended. And it's really the first time that I have seen HHS kind of take their HIPAA authorities, which do preempt less protective state laws, and use it to try to help entities better protect information from disclosure in response to the kind of opening up of civil and criminal accountability around pregnancy termination services.
Yeah, and just to recall, you were on, Deven, about a little under a year ago, and you went on for you a rant, but for everybody else, a very informed.
It was rant-worthy. It's so rant-worthy.
Your rants are like, so far away from everybody else's rants. It was an incredibly well-informed piece, but about the likely dangers of what was going to happen with Dobbs and HIPAA and law enforcement trying to get access to records. And we're starting to see this stuff happen. So I'd be fascinated to hear a lot more about that. I think this group and audience would love that. So let's definitely table that as one. Jen, what have you been, other than Mai Tais and different types of the health impact of different types of suntan cream or whatever? what have you been looking at?
Yeah, well, catching up after being away and mostly disconnected for a couple of weeks, I've really been digging in around all of the anti-LGBT legislation that's happening all over the country. And it's Pride Month, and that's usually such a celebratory, amazing time in San Francisco, and it has this air of just a lot of fear over it right now. And there are wildfires burning, and people can't breathe in one of the biggest cities in the US, and our government, our officials are worried about drag shows, and it's just like such a ridiculous distraction from the things that really matter. But it's also a really significant medical issue when states are passing laws trying to restrict the medical care that people can get, saying that people can deny medical services to folks based on their gender orientation or their, any other parameter. So it's I think it's a time that we all need to be much more vocal. The side that is against the progress that we've seen is really vocal. And so those that are for it and know that this is the right path forward, we need to be really vocal too. And so that's something that's really been taking a lot of my attention the last week or so, kind of catching up on everything that's been going on.
Yeah, and a couple of cases there. So I was thinking there's been a number of sort of things. So one is that the Florida, a federal judge stayed the Florida law, which is essentially would ban any kind of medical care for transgender individuals. but yeah, it's going to go to the Supreme Court. And today, the Supreme Court had a couple of rulings that were kind of unusual, right? So one was that it didn't allow. I just saw Chris Deacon on LinkedIn write about this. It did not allow, or it stopped something which was very obvious, which is essentially Safeway had been and I think another supermarket on drug pricing had been lying to Medicaid about its best prices, and was, this is a technical issue, but it was allowing them to Safeway claimed that what their best price wasn't their best price. So we'll get into the depths of the legislation in a second. But essentially, the Supreme Court said no, a corporation has got to abide by the law, which doesn't always say. And the other one, which was remarkable, is that just with Kavanaugh becoming just a woolly lefty liberal, it struck down the Alabama redistricting. Now, all that stuff had happened already in 2020, and we have a Republican Congress, Republican House, because of all that redistricting that went on in a bunch of states. But that to me is sort of a harbinger that when some of this stuff gets to the Supreme Court, I mean, we know what happened with Dobbs. I don't know what's going to happen with gay marriage, but with redistricting and some of this transgender stuff, when it gets there, it may not be as cut and dried as we think it is, even though we have this sort of 7-2 was it 63? So 63, conservative majority. So, maybe it's not quite as simple as we think it is. But I'm with you, Jen. I mean, you look into this stuff, and it's so. I go back to the case when the state legislature passed this thing banning transgender kids from taking part in high school sports, and the governor vetoed it because he said they did a count and there was one. Literally, we're getting this hue and cry and this stuff about mums for liberty, whatever they're called, going after library books and all of this stuff is happening, right?
Was it the Utah Supreme Court that struck their trans bill down? One of the states Supreme Court just struck it down the last week.
Don't remember who it was. I know the governor tried to veto it. I don't know if they overrode his veto. I think the Tennessee governor vetoed the drag bill in the House, because isn't Tennessee governor actually a Democrat? I think
there was a judge in Tennessee that struck down the anti-drag bill there, saying that it was vague and unconstitutional, which is clear, but it takes forever for the courts to counter some of the stuff that's happening in the legislation.
Yeah, I mean, and it's and obviously the court itself has been highly politicized since, well, I would say since 1991 at least, with Clarence Thomas's appointment. And
those are federal courts, like state courts, different animals. Sometimes those folks are elected actually at the state court level.
It was the Florida Supreme Court that struck down their trans bill.
Yeah,
portions of it anyway.
But I'm sure that'll get appealed by the government, right?
Yeah. I'm gonna go back to Jen's point. So I don't know if you've been following the case in Indiana with the doctor that did the abortion for the 10-year-old Ohio girl. So the medical board there reprimanded her. And, so I'm glad it wasn't worse, but I'm extremely disappointed that the medical societies and the medical profession generally are not speaking up more about all these bills. I mean, it is directly on their ability to practice medicine, and they're allowing the legislatures to override that. And why they're not up in arms, on strike, I do not understand. They talk about autonomy. These are clear challenges to their autonomy and to their patients' well-being.
Yeah.
So can we dive a bit, Deven, into what you've been talking about regarding the sort of the impact of this on privacy legislation and what ONC is trying to do in terms of threading the needle through the state laws?
Yeah.
Perhaps you give us a background about what, how
sure.
At what point HIPAA supersedes state law and vice versa, and then what are they going to try and do here?
Yeah. So, ordinarily the HIPAA privacy rule has had great deference to state law. So when the HIPAA statute was passed, which was not, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, it wasn't about privacy at all. It was about portability of health insurance in the large group market, and then also supporting standardization in the submission of claims information, both digitally and in accordance with certain forms. And Congress sort of said, oh, we better get some privacy rules in there if we're going to start digitizing all this claims data as we start to share it. And we are about to pass the statute and we can't take on privacy now. So they gave themselves 2 years to to enact privacy legislation with an automatic punt to the regulators to develop privacy rules for the HIPAA environment. And that's how the HIPAA privacy rules came about. But the statute itself basically says that HIPAA preempts state laws that conflict with it. So that's been interpreted to mean that if a state provides less privacy protection than HIPAA creates a floor. You can't go below that floor, but you could build on top of it. And hence you see a lot of state laws, for example, that require consent to share certain types of sensitive information, whereas HIPAA tends to sort of treat all information the same and not necessarily require consent for routine uses of data. So HIPAA has long, in the privacy rule itself, because it was a heavily negotiated rulemaking, Justice Department at the table helping to shape it, has always just allowed entities to share data if a state law requires them to share it. Even if it would be violative of privacy, state passes a law to share it, privacy rule defers to them by its terms in regulation. And then similarly, there's all kinds of provisions that allow for the doctors, hospitals, and health plans covered by HIPAA to, if law enforcement comes knocking on your door and they're trying to investigate a crime that may have occurred on the premises, you can share PHI, certain PHI to help them in that endeavor. And they're trying to locate victim of a crime, you can share certain information. So there's all these provisions. It was sort of, again, heavily negotiated rulemaking where law enforcement chimed in, we're going to need data for this, we're going to need data for this. And so they built in these express permissions for a lot of sharing with administrative and criminal enforcement authorities. They didn't have to do that, but they did. So consequently, now that we have an environment in the post-Dobbs world where states are passing laws that basically allow them to take data and utilize it in order to institute and a proceeding, whether it's in a civil proceeding, administrative proceeding, or a criminal case against someone for delivery of healthcare, right? So, and including, weaponizing it against the medical provider, whereas HIPAA has only traditionally protected the patients necessarily. You have some state statutes that actually where the criminally or civilly responsible party is the doctor. And so HIPAA had the statute gave HHS an opportunity to actually be more protective because Congress already said the HIPAA preempts weaker state laws. It's just at the time when the HIPAA rules were put into place, they didn't foresee that states would actually do what they've been doing in terms of passing these laws that essentially weaponizes where the data can be weaponized against people for performing a healthcare service that would be perfectly lawful in their jurisdiction. So they went, so they used that authority to basically say, look, to protect the right to travel for lawful healthcare, to say, all right, well, maybe it's against the law in Texas to deliver this kind of healthcare service. But if you're going to California or New Mexico to get that service, we're not going to allow data to be pulled out of New Mexico to allow you to prosecute the individual or her doctor for getting that care, even though it might have been a resident of the state of Texas. So I mean, it's a little bit complicated, but fitting within the sort of federalism framework, there's not much that HHS felt it could constitutionally do for states that have made certain types of healthcare illegal, but felt like constitutionally, with indication that the Supreme Court would probably support ultimately, if a case was brought before them, the right to travel for healthcare. They've basically said, look, if that service was delivered lawfully, either under state law or in that sort of sliver that the government has tried to protect around the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, that you have to treat somebody who's emergent, you have to at least stabilize them. If you have a pregnant person, you're supposed to treat that person as well. At any rate, HIPAA contains very few prohibitions. This is one of them. If the rules get finalized, which is to say, we're going to use HIPAA as a shield. We're going to and say, you covered entity, you can't disclose if the reason why this information is being sought is to enable someone to weaponize that data for the even where that service was provided lawfully. So lots and lots of sort of talk about how, how does a hospital figure out that somebody who's requesting the data is going to use it for wrong purposes. There's an attestation requirement in there, and lots of entities that are commenting on it have grave concerns about being found to be liable for a wrongful disclosure when they might not have known that the reason why the information was being sought was to engage in some sort of, to hand it over to authorities for some sort of administrative or criminal action, or in the state of Texas, of course, which authorizes civil lawsuits to be used for one of those lawsuits. It is right now, the proposal is limited only to information related to reproductive health care. But in some of the circles that I travel in terms of people that are commenting largely favorably on the rule, are wondering, why would we stop there?
Right.
Related to the transgender gender affirming care issues, Jen, that you raised and that Kim talked about, and that I know we've talked about in these settings before. So I stopped there.
No, that's fantastic, Deven. Thank you. And frankly, why would we stop there, right? Because there's all kinds of other stuff you can imagine around, care for addiction treatment and God knows what else, which similarly is infringing on that. So I just put up in our internal chat what the AMA is, the big 7 points the AMA is talking about in their Congress, which starts tomorrow, to go back to Kim's point. And they, two of them are about AI. In other words, don't let this AI take our job, as they would say on South Park, right? Two of them are about, one of them is about, good removing body mass index, BMI, as a standard measure. One about, classification of testosterone by the DEA. I don't know if that's good or bad or what that's about. And then there's a whole bunch about, good stuff, race conscious, being on the quote unquote good liberal side of keeping diversity requirements in medical schools and race conscious admissions practices in medical schools, and keeping ethical guidance for addressing barriers to equitable care. But I don't see here, and that is you'd think this is a direct impingement on, or the legislature we've seen, and it continues to be on. It's a direct impingement on physicians' right to practice. And as you said, Kim, that obstetrician was reprimanded in Indiana, for allegedly. I couldn't even get what they were trying to, other than the fact that she provided an abortion service. I couldn't think what they're actually trying to get her for legally. And
disclosing patient information.
She disclosed patient information. Yeah.
Well, she disclosed there was a patient.
She didn't really, but that's what they got her on.
Yeah.
I mean, you can say that, but I mean, that means every medical journal is guilty, aren't they? It strikes me it's the same thing, but whatever.
Well, actually, medical journals are supposed to get consent from patients before they use individual level patient data when they talk about a case, and usually they do. So,
and you have to remember, medical boards are typically appointed by the governor, so they're going to follow what the governor's political leanings are. And I also have to keep in mind, so a lot of doctors are Republicans. There are doctors that support some of this stuff.
Sure, and there are who. For the mifepristone, is that the right drug? That whole case in Texas, brought by a bunch of doctors, right? They didn't treat women. They don't.
Yep.
Reproductive health, but they're doctors. Yeah. I mean, you'll see this. Ian Morrison had a funny discussion some time ago on the gang about, he went down to I want to say Waco, not Waco, McAllen, Texas. And part of what he did was he gave this talk, and then one of the guys stood up and said, "You're all wrong, and Trump was right about all this stuff." And he said, "I'm not getting an argument with this guy, but there are clearly people in America who don't agree with other people. We know that, and this crosses all kinds of lines." I think I told some of you that I sat next to a heart surgeon from the University of Chicago who was an Indian immigrant. We started on a plane the other day, a couple of months ago. We had a lovely conversation starting about his experience in England and India and whatever, and it ended up being a complete rant between us, with him going on about basically how Putin and Trump were right, and how luckily Tucker Carlson is telling us that the world is about the correct things in the world, and all that lying liberal fake news media is and it wasn't like this guy came from a very different circumstance than the vast majority of nice liberal academic physicians we know. So it happens.
Did we lose
Sorry?
So I'd be curious to hear from Jen about, a lot of the large employers are now under fire for diversity efforts, whether it's Disney or Target or Budweiser. So being in the side of diversity and trans rights is all of a sudden, verboten in a lot of circles. I mean, how are your clients dealing with that?
Yeah, I can't speak specifically about any of our individual clients, but it's just a really, really challenging area to navigate right now. And you just see so many kind of ridiculous things in the news that are, again, just such a huge distraction from all of the things that actually matter right now. But I think it's a really, really tough place for corporate leaders right now, because there's a ton of expectation from employees that you are going to stand up for what you believe in, and that you are going to, do the right thing and live your values and so forth. And then there's, a lot of justifiable concern that you're going to end up in the media for, something that isn't the type of coverage that you want. So I think it's a interesting, it's a really interesting dynamic. What I do think, though, is also interesting is the news cycle is very short. And so even when some of these things come up, they don't really stick around too long, with some exceptions. So I think it's going to be fascinating just to see where companies land over the next several months, of what they do want to speak out about, what they don't want to. For Siegel, who I work for, who doesn't have enough name recognition to be plastered over the New York Times, so it's okay. For our Pride Month, our Pride BRG put together a theme of love every letter. So it's, really about, there's a lot of letters in LGBTQIA+, and, we need to really pay attention to the needs of every letter. And our company has been talking about that, really transparently, which people really appreciate. They want their companies to be standing for the things that they care about. So that's a lot without, any specific, any specific companies to talk about, but it's just a fascinating time. And there's so much that I feel like the employer and the medical community and the business community could get behind, because there are real things that matter to the business community that are not being addressed by our governments. And then a ton of stuff that is distracting from being able to have being able to have strong results that is getting the attention. So I would love to see that collective voice a little bit louder, so that there's less concern about the one-off companies being in the spotlight.
I just look, Target's stock price is still not recovered. I mean, they've lost billions of dollars in market cap over this. I mean, it's scary. And did you ever think that Chick-fil-A was going to be too woke? I mean, for God's sake.
I know. Well, that's ridiculous. Yeah.
I mean, this is a super complicated issue, right? Because you've got, on the one hand, the people who work at these companies, and yes, there's diversity of opinion on both sides there, but also there is the ability of in general, the younger the workforce, the more likely they are to have out members of the LGBTQ, like I'm saying, QIA community. They're more likely to have people of different ethnicities and mixed races. That's just America, right? America is getting more and more like that as you get on the street. If I talk about I know I live in Marin County, but like half of the middle school, not half. There are definitely people in the middle school class who are calling themselves they, them, and all my kids are, okay, they've been indoctrinated by these terrible liberal teachers, blah, blah, blah. But that's kind of the way it is. And if you go through it, this is something that exists now, and probably, Kim, not to pick on the two old white guys here, but it didn't really exist in our generation, right? This stuff you didn't hear about in the 80s. I even went back and looked at some comedy stuff from the 80s and the 90s of, lefty comedy, and the amount of sort of anti-gay rhetoric or in there that wasn't like was very different now than I think it would be.
Oh gosh, if you go back and watch movies from the 80s,
Oh
they're
my God.
horrible.
It's incredible.
Horrible.
They
Like,
don't stand the test of time.
and so much about date rape being a non-issue too. I mean,
16 candles.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
horrible.
So I mean, so I think that change is not an accident, right? That's been going on culturally, and the people trying to wind the clock back are clearly a minority. However, I would say two things. One is that big corporations do a bunch of stuff. They play off pacts on both sides. There are plenty of things that go through the Supreme Court that that good liberals don't approve, that are quite fine with these big corporations. Right now, while Disney is being the liberal heroes who are being woke about this issue, right? All their writers are on strike about. I mean, the studio's writers are all on strike, and they're not necessarily the world's most lovely. There's a lot of standard capitalism going on there anyway. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is you don't need a lot of people to make a lot of fuss, and make a lot of. Jen was saying earlier, you could be loud. I mean, the other night there was like a fist fight outside a school board that was doing Pride Month in some part of Southern California. I can't remember the exact city, some part in the LA suburbs, where you got enough right-wing, anti-woke, whatever protests, the Ron DeSantis, Trump folks, that you got enough of them out there that you could cause conversation. It's not going to pass the board, it's not going to win, but and you don't need that many people to frighten that population, frighten the school boards, frighten the individuals. We saw that during the pandemic, right? Most people were accepting of what was done. Didn't mean that a whole bunch of public health officials didn't have to go into hiding and had lose their jobs because they were threatened. And
Right.
Not that I want to bore you with my Mike McGee impersonation of what happened in history. Didn't take that many people in Germany, Italy, and elsewhere in the 20s and 30s to move those societies radically, and I think we have to pay attention. There was a great article by Ken Frazier, who was at Merck and is now a General Catalyst, talking about the Florida issue and the book banning. I mean, as a business guy, but also as a senior African American leader and cultural leader, saying this stuff is really bad, and
It's really bad.
we can't like whitewash the past when we know what's been.
Did you see what the family in Utah did? They got the Bible banned.
Oh yes, that's right.
They put out there's stuff in the Bible about incest, genocide, bestiality, slavery, and so I think every state that's got book bans, parents should be getting the Bible banned everywhere to show like turnabout is fair play here.
I'm sorry.
I agree with you, Matthew. This stuff is very serious, and the fact that the NAACP has declared Florida to be an unsafe place, like there's a travel advisory, and the Human Rights Campaign I was just reading has declared a state of emergency right now for LGBTQ people. I mean, this is not like performative. This is serious. Like lives are at risk. And I would say that a lot of the Dobbs decision, in certain states is also, you should think twice about where you send your daughters to college, for example. I mean, this is no joke. And so I think a lot about how that lead up to Nazi Germany. And when you go to the Holocaust museums and look at how incrementally things could be accepted, like the book bans, et cetera, and where things landed, I think you have to be ever vigilant. And if you're not calling it out, then you're complicit. And I put corporate America right there if they're not calling it out. That because lives are on the line. And so essentially, if that's okay with you, I have a huge problem with that, because then you're valuing different lives differently. And that has to be called out. I think it's deadly serious. And that was no pun intended.
Some of you would know more than me, but I believe some of the state abortion laws can hold people in other states criminally liable if they assist in abortions in those states where it's legal. I mean, like if we start allowing that, God help us all, it's going to be the lowest common denominator who wins.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the kind of where again, the proposed rule is intended to step in and block at least the transmission of data to facilitate an action like that.
Yeah, it's a very it's a very tricky issue from the sort of corporate standpoint, right? Because then you start talking about, well, okay, who can you trade with and where can you do what? So, to take the bête noire of the liberals at the moment, our friend Elon Musk, right, did he shut down something in Turkey because he was semi-threatened by there, but he was being counterfeited to the Chinese about this, that, and the other because he has cars built there. Plenty of corporations have got interest in many different countries. Obviously, this week, the most cherished and hallowed organization in America, and I mean the PGA, finally sort of caved in and said, we'll take the Saudi money because it's costing us too much. You have a lot of sort of moral relativism going on, and I understand, but you can't expect. The history of capitalism is that politics tends to kind of supersede this stuff. And
well, look at the movement to divest from South Africa, and that seemed like back when I was in college, it was just a bunch of college students, and who was ever going to get enough attention? And it did. I mean, that was absolutely morally the right thing to do.
I agree, and it worked. But I'm saying, in general, corporations will blow with the wind, right? It's not in their charter, their interest, or their nature, or their culture to stand up and be the first people to do this.
I hate to say it, but I don't think today's Republican politicians would go along with that. I think they would fight even the South Africa thing.
Well, quite possibly, yeah. But I mean,
you don't have people in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, it's.
Well, I think I just was looking at probably because at Chris Sununu, who is he's one of the few not running for president on the Republican side. And his piece in the Washington Post was quite interesting. And he said, there were many salient lines, but one that I'm going to pull out is that he said, for Republicans, every time they open their mouths to talk about banning abortion, an independent voter joins the Democrats. And that they're basically they will become an irrelevant party if they continue with these culture war issues.
You say that, and I hope he's right, but I mean, and we're about to find out how bad this schism in, just on the politics of this, right? We're about to go into debate season, and then eventually, like, who's going to really raise money for the primaries. So we're coming up to that point where at a time when the guy who's the former president, the ex-leader, the still the leader in the polls, is being indicted, has already been indicted once. Likely been done in the next couple of weeks for the God knows for what.
The documents.
Espionage Act.
Mark Meadows
violation.
Who knows what different things he's going to be done for? While this is going to be going on during the primaries. So this is we were talking about unprecedented. This is unprecedented territory. But we're gonna find out what the Republicans are going to do. But don't forget, we knew what the country does. Nobody who had many illusions about what Trump was like. And he lost, but he didn't lose by that much back in 2020. And we know what the Republicans are in general like, and they just won the House. Now, there was gerrymandering, what have you. It wasn't like it wasn't like in California where they're a teeny minority and they're sort of politically irrelevant. They're still dominant in many, many states. I mean, hence the issues that Deven was raising about. Because if you didn't have Republican majorities and supermajorities in many of those states, you wouldn't have this legislation. So I hope Sununu is right, and my wife listens to the podcast every morning from Morning Joe, the guy who used to be the Republican from Florida who used to have Matt Gaetz's seat, and he's now a sort of firm anti-Trump. And he keeps on going about how great it was when Ronald Reagan was around, because Reagan was talking about the better dreams of our natures and wasn't divisive and all this stuff, which is true if you listen to what Reagan was saying. He was pro-immigrant and pro-American and pro this, that, and the other. But I don't see that stuff coming back, and I don't see that many people saying, well, I'm going to be a permanent Democrat, and the Democratic Party, has got its own divisions. So,
yeah.
Well,
the piece of that too, Matthew, is all of the gerrymandering in these states. And I just saw it pop up that the Supreme Court actually
they
ruled that the Mississippi maps were unfair.
Alabama.
Alabama. Yep.
Yeah. But
So it's going to be fascinating.
my point is, Jen, I don't disagree, but if you look at Americans, 60% of white males were voting for Trump. It's not like and there are more, I think, white male voters than any other flavor of voter in America. Maybe there are more
Well,
white.
in Ohio, they were ordered by the Supreme Court to redraw their maps, which they did. The quote bipartisan commission came up with several maps, each of which was worse than the last. And they basically waited out until the state Supreme Court was no longer 5-4, and they gained the majority. And they basically just ran out the clock. So now we're still using the gerrymandered maps, even though we had a referendum saying we want to use new maps. We want to use maps that are fair. And they just completely ignored the will of the people and ran out the clock to make sure that the Supreme Court the state would abide by them. Now they're trying to change the rules about who can do a referendum. So they're trying to raise the minimum from 50% to 60%, and you have to win a majority in each one of the 88 counties in Ohio, which you're never going to get a referendum again. They're completely taking the voice away from the people.
So, I mean, put my political science bat on for a second, and then we should talk about healthcare. This is but I mean,
if only this
what happened in Italy and Germany in the 30s is probably not the model. But what happened in Hungary, and Turkey and some other countries, where slowly over years and years, a little bit's got taken away, a little bit's got taken away, a little bit's taken away, is part of the model for some of these states. And, you just reset the Overton window, and at some point, things that were, seemed to be normal and were okay are not okay. And, it's very hard if you allow the control of who gets voted, when you don't have, unless you have a super majority against you, it's really tough. And even in those cases, those fascist regimes fell apart. Germany fell apart externally, but the ones in Spain and Portugal and Latin America stayed around for a long time. So I am deeply worried about how this ends up. But
not only stayed around, but were our allies.
Well, and we didn't know. No one said happy birthday to Henry Kissinger this week, who was responsible for a lot of those people being around.
Well, to bring it back to where we started with the fires, I saw an interesting thing last night. I occasionally delve into Twitter, depending on my mood, but but a whole bunch of talk about the fact that these insurance companies are now saying certain areas are going to be uninsurable, and that homeowners insurance.
People who buy houses in ski resorts in California may find they can't get insurance.
So that talk about corporate interests versus politics and what really gets people's attention. There was just a lot of interesting commentary that this may be the way that people are kind of forced to get more woke on climate change if they were resisting, because there's it's going to affect their pocketbook in terms of and options of where to live. So I don't know. I thought that was interesting. And that's just like a bunch of actuaries doing their math. And
so as I understand it, in Florida, there are no national property and casualty companies that will issue homeowners policies. Their average cost is like 4 times the national average. The only ones they've got there are state and regional ones, and they're all broke. The laws regulating them have driven them into bankruptcy, and still their costs are high. And nobody's talking about solutions. Nobody's trying to fix the problem.
I mean, I think, but this is, so I'll tell you my example. So I do own a nice holiday home up in the Lake Tahoe region, and you cannot buy insurance for that because of the forest fire issue. And the insurance cost there is you have to buy it from the state. There's a state fund, and you buy that, and you have to buy a supplemental policy. And the cost to my house there, which is about half the size and half the value, little under half the value of my house down in Marin County, which, by the way, is also got a lot of trees and is in a fire zone. It works out to about 4.5 times the cost. So it's really, it's substantially different. And a lot of America's and the world is facing this issue. Having said that, again, this is an issue that I don't know there's much we can do about it, because it's such a global. This is back to the rowboat. It's such a global problem. How do you deal with the fact that Florida is going to see sea level rise? Actually, I do have a solution for that. I read about it on a thing called I forget the name of the blog, but it's called sea flooding. And what you do is you flood the Dead Sea back up to, which is below sea level, and you find about 5 or 6 other places around the world which are like that, which are close enough to a sea that you can build a pipeline to flood the low level land below sea and create new lakes. And that will reduce the sea, that will sort of absorb the sea level rise. So it was a brilliant idea. I don't know. You know, you're going to need massive geoengineering projects.
Yeah, with a gigantic pipe that's going to have to go through someone's backyard, so it's never going to get built.
Well, I
Say
think
goodbye to Holland.
I mean, essentially, I mean, realistically, we're seeing this already, right? With sea level rise, you know, and the melting of the ice fields in Antarctica. This is going to happen. That's why you know, Florida, Miami already is spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a sort of pumping system, and you know, to try and keep.
Yeah. Well, it was fascinating. Back to my vacation, but a lot of the islands in French Polynesia, they can't be more than 10 feet above sea level at any point, and they're old. I mean, they're ancient atolls. So 20 million years ago, there was a volcano there, and then it erupted, and then started to dissipate, and now you have this ring of coral islands, and you know, there's dozens of them, and they're absolutely magnificent, and so vulnerable to any sort of sea rise.
Yeah, we may be creeping off the expertise of the majority of the panel here, but
yeah, I think so.
but it's clearly, you know, it's clearly the case. This stuff is, as Rosie said at the start, this stuff, it's an ecosystem. Everything impacts everything else, and I'm particularly worried about, you know, we have and on the topic of things that the ecosystems that move around, there was a good article, I think, in the Washington Post about and I forget, it was an opinion piece, who wrote it, about what's going on in Latin America, and you know, the need for, why are people leaving Latin America and coming to the border, and you know, now one thing is that the US demographically needs immigrants, and we're not allowed to say that, but it's definitely true given the worker shortage we're seeing. But the other thing is that there's a lot of violence going on south of the border. So where did the guns come? You know, maybe they're smuggling drugs from people north. Where do the guns that all this violence, you know, happens to where do they all come from? All comes from here, right? It's all being sent south by Mexico by, you know, armed gangs and drug cartels and what have you. And you know, so anything that happens in one country does have impacts elsewhere, and we know that's the case. So, you know, I was thinking about that, all these things being linked, and when you start talking about climate change and the impact on health, it's not just the fact that people in New York's asthma rates are going to go through the roof. It's not just the fact that I can afford but only just to pay for my insurance on my house. All these things are impacting each other, and they're also, you know, and this is the thing which we know is on a policy basis. I'll come back to you in a second here, Rosemarie. They're also making, you know, all this division and all this division and rancor and difference of opinions, and the political impact of that with the gerrymandering, all the stuff we talked about, makes it much harder to pass any legislation to deal with it at a time when we're now putting people in Medicare, off Medicaid, right? I mean, friends, 600,000 people have left Medicaid since the since the end of the emergency. Is that correct?
At least.
Yeah. So I don't know. That's my little rant. Not as good as Deven's rants, and not as informed by the facts. But
immigration is way out of my wheelhouse. But two things I've thought. Like, first, if you got people that are willing to walk 1,000 miles through the desert to come to your country, those are the people you want as citizens. And second, if we're worried about Social Security and Medicare, the best way to shore up the finances are to get a bunch of young workers. So, like, let these people in, let them work.
And they're people we don't have to pay for the first 20 years of their life while we're trying to do this way.
Well, on that topic, it's really worth reading. The New York Times and the Washington Post have both done a lot of deep dives on the really the exploitation of the undocumented minors that have come, and the numbers of them that are working and not in school, or working full-time while also trying to go to high school and so forth. And, you know, there were at least 250,000 kids under the age of 18 that came into the US in the last, you know, 2 years or so. And at the same time, these same legislators who are passing the anti-drag laws and the anti-trans laws and so forth, they're trying to relax the child labor laws.
Yeah.
And they're successfully relaxing them, doing things like oh, it should be a parent's choice if a 14-year-old works a night shift. So this is another one I'd love the AMA and some others to come out to say, we don't need 14-year-olds working night shifts. We need them in school. And, for the corporations that need a talent pipeline, we don't need 16-year-olds working. We need high school graduates. We need, educated folks coming into the workforce who got to develop properly. So there's, all of these things going on that are just not serving any sort of logical progress for us.
That trend completely took me by surprise. I'm like, who is supporting more relaxed child labor laws? I mean, who does this benefit? It's got to be large employers that, as you say, want to exploit undocumented people. Like, it's just crazy. Do we live in the the 19th century? Right.
The goal is to get us back there, I think, for many of these people, right?
Yeah.
But I would say it's back to the same issue we've had over these. I just said we're not going to fix the politics of healthcare. We need a grand coalition plan to deal with immigration here, which deals with economic development and safety and governments in all through Latin America, right, and all the way down to South America, right, and in the Caribbean, right, with Haitian immigrants arriving in Venezuela and Colombia and coming north. We need to get it so that it's stable, that you can stay at your home, and that there's development there. Because otherwise, you said, Kim, if the answer is otherwise you're going to get killed by gangs, walking through the desert, for 1,000 miles. If that's a viable alternative to where you're living at home, I mean, we've got to fix what's going on at home. And, I just don't see the level, Biden said some great stuff, but I don't see the level of imagination, the possibility that this would have to be led by America, right? Have to buy in corporations to a rational guest worker or immigration process and policy that works. Have to be led by, governments that some kind of, the Organization of American States or somebody coming up with a way that you can do something about this. And it has to have something to do with gun control and gang control, and as well. That seems to be a problem that's so big we're not going to start to deal with it. I just can't see anyone having that conversation. So I'm very depressed about that.
Well, and to pile on, then, if you think about what's going on in Africa, when you think about climate change and how you're basically losing any remaining arable farmland, which is so disruptive. I mean, beyond disruptive, it's like costing lives, et cetera, as more stuff, the desertification of more and more places, which then leads people who are already impoverished to be more desperate. Now, they can't easily cross a border to get into the US, but it is all part of that ecosystem set of challenges that need to be addressed. I don't know if we're big on solutions here today.
All to be solved by this sea flooding, because apparently if you actually replace these things, you put, eventually you can create, although you're putting salt water into them, eventually as it evaporates off, you can make these salt flats and reduce desalination. Eventually you can make whole new areas of the desert in Egypt and elsewhere arable land. I don't know. So it was a fascinating thing, but I mean, somebody somewhere has got. Well, apparently the Israelis nearly have been thinking about doing it for the Dead Sea and have actually got some plans going. But these are, we're talking about, again, can the globe as a whole get together to do these massive projects, which hopefully will fix some of the problems that were caused doing it. And
was planet Earth just some grand experiment that is just turned into a.
Right, we're now back to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, whereas the white mice were the ones who were like doing the experiment on the humans. The globe was built to answer the question, built to develop the question to what was the answer to which was 42. Was anyway. So maybe. All right, we're getting close to the end, so we should probably talk about healthcare for a second. As in, what do we think is some of the healthcare stories we're going to be following in the coming weeks? So why don't I start with you, Kim, to get us out of here?
Well, I have to say mine is not healthcare per se, but I'm watching the clown car in the House of Representatives. The crazies have taken over, and now the House can't do any business at all. It's like, part of me is, delighted at the comedy of it, and part of me is terrified for the country.
Well, I mean, that does impact some stuff. Rosemarie, what are your sort of healthcare? What are you looking at next week or so?
I think you alluded to the folks who are coming off of the Medicaid program and how that's being handled differently in different states. And so some of it will be, there'll be a little more of a safety net in other places. So this isn't just the next week, this is over the coming months, as this year plays out. So I'm kind of keeping an eye on that.
All right. Jen.
Well, we're starting to think ahead to annual enrollment in the fall and the changes that our clients are going to be making for next year. And so I'll be really curious over the next couple of months where we see some of those shifts going. Are we going to keep focusing on mental health, keep focusing on women's health? Where are we going to see some cuts in some industries? So that's kind of what I have my eye on, which I think will be really interesting to see where things go.
So you're thinking that maybe after what it's been now, basically a decade plus of incredible unlimited benefits and desperation to get anybody come on any weight loss program or infertility program, whatever else that we might want to add, that might we might start seeing a turn on that.
I think a lot of companies are evaluating what's actually making a difference, and how do we get back some of this sprawl of just having so many niche providers. So we'll definitely see some changes.
Yeah, I've been in touch with a couple of the companies who are trying to be the navigator function and saying, here's one phone call you can call, and we'll have a whole ring of different companies, which are under our umbrella. And if you look, United Health Group, was it United Healthcare or United Health Group, just announced a similar program, which had a bunch of companies were in, to sort of say, you can call us and we'll handle this because it's too complicated for HR departments to have 27 different vendors. And I think that's interesting. I wonder if there'll be actual things that that are super expensive. We've gone through a whole thing without mentioning GLP-1 drugs or infertility. Well, I mentioned infertility just now, but the things that cost a lot of money on an individual basis. And I wonder if at some point, people who've been paying for that stuff will start saying, perhaps not anymore. All right, Deven.
Well, I'm continuing to watch for the finalization of rules around enforcement of the information blocking provisions, at least against certified electronic medical records and health information networks. The proposed enforcement rule was more than 2 years or just shy of 2 years ago, and it's not Office of the National Coordinator's rule. It's a rule coming out of the Office of the Inspector General, which has the penalty authority. But ONC has been talking a lot about how, this rule is coming, it's coming. And I think some of the promise of the information blocking rule is really quite dependent on, seeing if HHS really has the guts, stamina, and resources to actually push on some of the blocking behaviors or the ways that data has been obstructed. So, or not flown as well as it should for legitimate purposes. So I keep thinking any day now we should get it. It was actually due March 2023.
Well, we're basically still in March 2023, aren't we?
Yeah,
We're more or less still in March 2020.
Same quarter.
So it's all right. Yeah. The one thing which we didn't mention, we have two things. Remarkably, we've done the entire show without mentioning AI, other than the bit that the AMA wants to make sure that the AI doesn't steal the jobs of whomever, but it's going to steal a lot of jobs, no question, and changed them. Always changed a lot of jobs. But the other thing which didn't really come up is there's been a lot of sort of naughty behavior exposed in the last week or so, and I read about this. But some of it from some of the digital health companies who weren't paying attention. So Papa got in the news for being not basically looking at what its Papa pals were doing when they were going to the house of seniors, and having people who had criminal records or whatever sneaking through the not being trained properly or whatever, and some incidents that occur from that. And then just actually, I did mention last week's show, Alina, right, got a New York Times piece about how they were not letting their doctors, they'd actually fixed their Epic system so you couldn't set an appointment or prescribe a treatment as somebody who owed the system money. On the nice end of that, Scan Health Plan, which Sachin Jain actually made several $100,000 contribution to whatever that organization is that relieves medical bills, and got rid of about, $50 million worth of medical debt. So, some either non-profit corporation was doing nice things, but we're still in a world in which all that, healthcare is a business is capitalism, and we're going to cut corners, and or we're going to visit bad stuff on people who may not be able to pay, is still really there. So
New study in Health Affairs Today showed that nonprofit hospitals, as their profits increased, their charitable contributions decreased. So
Yeah, and those are tax exempt, not just nonprofit, right?
Yeah. It's quite. And by the way, a study last week showed that the Blues was referred to in stat that the Blues, including North Carolina, which got a big tax rebate, the nonprofit Blues aren't paying, even though they're not all tax exempt, are not paying a lot of tax, and they're making a lot of profit. So, those old problems and old issues are never going to leave us. Right. Okay. Well, I mean, we'll be following up on all of that stuff. I'll be back with another version of THCB Gang next week. Different cast of characters, but I look forward to that and seeing you all there. And you have been watching and listening to Kim Bellard from the semi-smoke-filled Midwestern climes of Cincinnati, Deven McGraw from the worst polluted place in America, or one of them, Washington, D.C., Jen Benz in San Francisco, but spiritually still on the beach in Tahiti, and Rosemarie Day from Day Health Strategies in the wilds of Massachusetts. And I'm Matthew Holt, saying thank you very much for watching and listening to THCB Gang. We will see you next week, which I think is June the 15th. Same time, same place. Thank you very much.